The sound begins as a low, rhythmic pulse, a deep, resonant breathing that has not ceased for millions of years. It is the voice of the Bay of Bengal, pushing and pulling against the fine sands of the Coromandel coast with a patient, relentless energy. Each wave rolls in with a soft hiss, a liquid sigh that dissolves into the shoreline, carrying with it the scent of salt, damp earth, and the faint metallic tang of deep ocean currents. Here, on the eastern edge of India, the water does not merely meet the land, it seems to be in a constant, ancient conversation with it, a dialogue of erosion and deposition, of hiding and revealing. The air at twilight is heavy and still, holding the warmth of the day like a fading memory. As the light softens into a bruised palette of violet and indigo, the horizon blurs, making it difficult to tell where the sea ends and the sky begins. It is a time of suspension, a moment where the modern world feels thin and the weight of deep time becomes almost tangible. Along this stretch of coast lies Mamallapuram, a place where the granite of the earth has been carved into dreams, and where the silence of the stones speaks louder than the roar of the surf. Standing alone on the very edge of the tide is the shore temple. It is a solitary sentinel of salt-worn stone, its two spires reaching upward like frozen flames. For over 1,300 years it has endured the lashing of monsoons and the corrosive touch of the sea spray, yet it remains, a lone survivor of a grandeur that has largely vanished from the surface of the earth. The temple is built of blocks of granite, stacked with such precision that they have defied the centuries. Though the intricate carvings of gods and mythical beasts have been softened by time, their features smoothed away until they look like figures emerging from a dream. As you listen to the rhythmic pull of the water, it is easy to imagine that the temple is not alone, that it is merely the last visible fragment of something much larger, much deeper. For centuries, local fishers and travellers spoke of a city of 7 pagodas, a line of magnificent temples that once stretched along this coast. According to the legends, the beauty of these structures was so great that it provoked the jealousy of the gods, who sent the ocean to swallow 6 of them, leaving only one to stand as a reminder of what was lost. For a long time, mainstream history regarded these stories as mere mythology, the colourful exaggerations of a seafaring people. But history has a way of hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal its secrets. Before we journey deeper into the mystery of what lies beneath these waves, I want to take a moment to welcome you. If you are settling in for the night and finding comfort in these echoes of the past, you are exactly where you belong. Here at the Slumber Archives, we bring you new history narrations every single day, crafted to help you drift into a peaceful sleep. If you enjoy these journeys through time, consider subscribing so you never miss a night of discovery, and perhaps leave a like to help other weary travellers find their way to us. Now let us return to the Whispering Shores and the secrets they kept for 1,000 years. The shore temple was constructed during the 8th century under the reign of the Pallava Dynasty, a line of kings who were obsessed with the enduring nature of stone. They did not merely build, they transformed the landscape, turning massive boulders into chariots and cliff faces into epic tapestries of divine descent. This was the era of the great King Narasimhavarman II, also known as Rajasimha, or the Lion King. He sought to create a sacred space where the divine could meet the mortal at the very edge of the world. To understand the shore temple, one must understand the concept of the monolithic, the idea of a structure birthed from a single, continuous piece of the earth. While the shore temple itself is built of layered blocks, it sits amidst a landscape of rathas, or stone chariots, each hewn from a single outcropping of granite. This is a feat of engineering that defies easy explanation, requiring a knowledge of geology and stone stress that seems almost impossible for the period. Archaeologists look for stratigraphy, the study of soil layers that tells us the age of a site, but here the story is written in the stone itself and in the way the stone has been reclaimed by the elements. And so, for generation after generation, the shore temple stood as a solitary monument. European sailors in the 18th century, including the British traveller John Goldingham, recorded the tales of the Seven Pagodas. They claimed that as they sailed past Mamallapuram, they could see the tops of copper domes glinting beneath the waves during low tide, a ghost city of bronze and granite shimmering in the depths. Yet, when the first formal surveys were conducted, no evidence of these structures could be found. The sea was dark, the silt was thick, and the skeptics argued that the pagodas were simply natural rock formations distorted by the light and the movement of the water. But the ocean is a keeper of vast, cold memories. It operates on a scale of time that dwarfs human civilization, rising and falling in cycles governed by the shifting of the planet's axis and the melting of distant ice. There is a period known to geologists as the Younger Dryas, a sudden, cold snap roughly 12,800 years ago that ended with a rapid rise in sea levels. While the temples of Mamallapuram are much younger than that, the memory of the land being swallowed by the sea is a recurring theme in the collective psyche of the region. It is as if the people knew, instinctively, that the boundary between the earth and the water is far more fragile than we care to admit. The mystery remained locked away until the 26th of December, 2004. On that morning, the world changed. A massive earthquake off the coast of Sumatra triggered a tsunami that raced across the Indian Ocean. As the great wave approached the shores of Mamallapuram, a strange and terrifying phenomenon occurred. The sea did not simply rise, it retreated. For a few brief, haunting minutes, the ocean pulled back nearly 500 meters, exposing the seafloor in a way that no living person had ever witnessed. And there, in the sudden, naked mud and sand, the myths became reality. The retreating water revealed long, straight rows of squared stone blocks, the foundations of massive walls, and the unmistakable outlines of man-made structures. For a heartbeat in time, the 6 missing pagodas seemed to rise from their watery graves, their dark shapes glistening in the sun before the wall of water returned to reclaim them. When the wave finally receded and the salt spray settled, the landscape had been forever altered. The force of the water had scrubbed away centuries of silt and sand, leaving behind a trail of evidence that could no longer be ignored. In the aftermath, divers and underwater archaeologists from the National Institute of Oceanography began to explore the area just offshore. What they found was a sprawling complex of submerged ruins, walls that stretched for hundreds of meters, stone platforms, and carvings that matched the style of the shore temple. These were not natural rocks. They were the remnants of a city that had been drowned, perhaps by a slow rise in sea levels, or perhaps by a sudden, catastrophic event like the very tsunami that had just revealed them. As we sit by the shore in our minds, the water continues its rhythmic work. We are forced to wonder how much more lies just beyond our reach. How many other civilizations have been hushed by the rising tides? The shore temple stands as a bridge between these worlds, the visible and the invisible, the remembered and the forgotten. It reminds us that our history is not a solid, unchanging thing, but a collection of fragments salvaged from the deep. The granite walls of the temple are cool to the touch now, the heat of the sun having long since bled away into the night. The shadows stretch across the sand, reaching toward the water as if trying to reconnect with the stones that lie beneath. There is a profound peace in this place, a sense that even when things are lost to the sea, they are not truly gone. They are simply waiting for the tide to turn, for the water to pull back, and for the story to begin once more. The rhythmic sound of a chisel striking granite once echoed across this coastline, a steady, metallic heartbeat that defined the 7th century. It was a sound of creation, of a king's will being carved into the very bones of the earth. King Narasimhavarman I did not merely wish to build temples, he sought to bridge the gap between the terrestrial and the divine, using the immovable permanence of the mountains as his canvas. He was known as Mamalla, the great wrestler, a title that spoke to his physical prowess. Yet his greatest struggle was not against a human opponent, but against the stubborn, unyielding nature of the stone itself. Under his reign, the Pallava Dynasty reached a zenith of artistic and political power, turning the quiet shores of Mamallapuram into a bustling, cosmopolitan gateway to the world. Imagine the harbour as it was then, a forest of wooden masts swaying in the salt breeze, ships arriving from the distant reaches of China, Southeast Asia, and the Roman Mediterranean. The air would have been thick with the scent of exotic spices, drying fish, and the ionized tang of the spray hitting the rocks. It was a place where languages blurred together, where merchants traded gold for silk and stories for philosophy. Yet, amidst this frantic energy of commerce, the king remained focused on a silent, monumental ambition. He looked at the massive boulders strewn across the landscape, erratic blocks of granite left behind by ancient geological shifts, and he did not see obstacles. He saw gods waiting to be released. There is a specific philosophy in this kind of architecture, a concept known as monolithic carving, where a structure is not built by adding brick upon brick, but by subtracting everything that is not the temple. It is a process of refinement, an act of spiritual archaeology where the form is discovered within the mass. The Pallava artisans began at the summits of these boulders, working their way downward, carving intricate roof lines, delicate cornices, and life-sized elephants directly out of the living rock. This was a radical departure from the wooden or brick structures of the past, which were susceptible to the rot of the humid air or the hunger of fire. By choosing granite, Narasimhavarman was reaching for eternity. He was ensuring that his vision would endure long after the empires of his rivals had crumbled into dust. As the years passed, the landscape began to transform into a dreamscape of stone. The king's architects were masters of stratigraphy, though they would not have called it that, possessing an intuitive understanding of the rock's layers, its veins, and its hidden fractures. They knew exactly where to strike to avoid a split that could ruin years of labour. This was a time of profound intellectual blending, where the technical precision of engineering met the fluid grace of poetry. The temples were designed to be more than just places of worship. They were meant to be mirrors of the cosmos. Every pillar, every frieze depicting a celestial being or a forest animal was a verse in a grand, silent hymn to the order of the universe. One can almost feel the weight of those forgotten ages when walking through the site today. There is a sense of deep time here, a reminder that our current understanding of history is often just a thin layer of sediment resting upon much older, much stranger foundations. We speak of the 7th century as the beginning, but the stones themselves are millions of years old, born in the cooling crust of a young earth. Narasimhavarman was merely the one who gave them a voice. He turned the shoreline into a gallery of the impossible, where entire mountains were hollowed out to create pillared halls, known as mandapas, where the shadows seemed to hold their breath. And yet, for all the grandeur of the port and the beauty of the carvings, there is a haunting quality to the king's ambition. History tells us that many of these projects were never truly finished. Some suggest that the sudden death of a monarch or the shifting tides of war brought the chisels to a silent halt. Others wonder if the sea itself began to whisper a warning. a premonition of the day when the water would reclaim what the land had so boldly displayed. As the sun set on the Pallava Golden Age, the cosmopolitan crowds eventually thinned. The ships sailed for other horizons, and the great stone city began its long, slow retreat into the realm of myth. The transition from a living city to a legendary one is a slow, quiet process. It happens in the spaces between the records, in the gaps of the chronicles where the ink has faded. We are left to wonder about the intentions of those master builders. Did they know that the granite would eventually be smoothed by the salt air, their sharp lines softened by the persistent touch of the wind? Or did they believe they had truly conquered time? The sheer scale of the vision, the 7 pagodas that were said to line the shore, suggests a confidence that borders on the divine. It was a landscape designed to be seen from the ocean, a beckoning line of towers that served as both a spiritual beacon and a testament to human persistence. In the quiet of the night, when the only sound is the rhythmic pulse of the Bay of Bengal, it is easy to imagine the king standing on the pier, looking out at his creation. The white surf would have crashed against the base of the shore temple, spraying the dark stone with a fine mist. He would have seen the flickering lamps of the priests and the distant fires of the merchant camps, a constellation of human effort mirrored in the dark water. It was a moment of perfect balance, a brief window in history where the power of a dynasty and the beauty of the natural world were in complete harmony. But harmony is a fragile thing. The very features that made Mamallapuram a perfect port, its proximity to the deep water and its open exposure to the sea, also made it vulnerable. The ocean is a patient observer. It watches the rise of kings and the carving of mountains with an indifference that is both beautiful and terrifying. As the Pallava influence began to wane in the late 8th century, the story of the 7 pagodas began to drift away from the world of facts and into the world of travellers' tales. The cosmopolitan port became a place of mystery, a site where the line between the natural and the man-made started to blur. We are left to grapple with the limits of what we know. We rely on carbon dating and the study of ancient texts, but these are merely tools to measure the surface of a much deeper reality. The stones of Mahabalipuram carry a memory that predates our language, a memory of a time when the world felt larger and the gods felt closer. The king's vision was a bridge built toward that greatness, a golden vision that sought to freeze a moment of perfection in the hardest substance known to man. But as the centuries turned into millennia, the question remained: what happens to a vision when the world moves on? What happens when the sea decides that it wants its stones back? The answer was hidden for 1,000 years, buried in the silt and the silence of the deep, waiting for a moment when the earth would tremble and the veil would finally be lifted. For centuries, the horizon off the coast of Coromandel was more than just a meeting of salt and sky. It was a map of ghosts. European mariners, their wooden hulls creaking under the weight of spice and silk, spoke of a landmark that defied the logic of the maps they carried. They called it the 7 Pagodas. As they navigated the treacherous currents of the Bay of Bengal, these sailors claimed to see 7 distinct towers rising like jagged crowns against the morning mist. To the weary eyes of a navigator, these structures were a beacon of safety, a sign that the ancient port of Mahabalipuram was near. But as the ships drew closer to the shore, the math of the landscape began to fail. Only one temple remained standing on the sand, the shore temple, clinging to the edge of the continent, while its 6 siblings seemed to have dissolved into the spray. The records of these early travellers, from the Venetian merchants to the British explorers of the 1700s, are filled with a quiet, persistent confusion. They wrote of a city that seemed to be half submerged, a place where the architecture of man continued beneath the waves. They were witnessing a fragment of a memory, a skeletal remain of a much larger vision that the ocean had claimed for its own. And yet, for the people who lived upon these shores, the disappearance of the 6 temples was not a mystery of erosion or rising tides, but a story of divine consequence. Local folklore, whispered through the generations in the small fishing villages that line the coast, tells of a city so beautiful that it stirred the envy of the heavens. It is said that the king Mahabali, for whom the town is named, presided over a kingdom of such prosperity and architectural wonder that it rivaled the celestial cities of the gods. The city was adorned with 7 magnificent temples, each one a masterpiece of carved granite, their gilded finials catching the light of the sun and casting a glow that could be seen for leagues. But beauty on such a scale often carries a heavy price. The legends speak of Indra, the god of rain and storms, looking down from his throne and feeling a cold spark of jealousy. He could not endure the existence of a mortal city that rivaled the splendor of his own divine realm. In his anger, he summoned the clouds in the depths of the sea, unleashing a storm that lasted for days. The sky turned the color of bruised plums, and the ocean rose up in a terrifying wall of water, sweeping over the streets and the markets, the palaces and the gardens. When the waters finally receded, the city was gone. 6 of the 7 temples had been dragged into the abyss, swallowed by the silt and the darkness of the deep. Only one was left behind, a solitary witness to the grandeur that had been lost, left to stand on the beach as a reminder of the fragility of human ambition. This story was passed down from father to son among the fishing communities, people whose lives are dictated by the rhythms of the water. To the outside world, the tale of Indra's wrath was dismissed as mere mythology, the kind of colourful exaggeration that naturally grows around ancient ruins. Historians and archaeologists, trained in the rigorous methods of stratigraphy, the study of rock layers to determine the passage of time, searched for evidence of these lost structures, but found only silence. They looked at the granite outcrops and the shifting sands and concluded that the 7 pagodas were a poetic fiction, a phantom created by the play of light on the water, or the hopeful imagination of sailors long at sea. But the fishermen knew better. They spoke of nets getting snagged on something heavy and unyielding far from the shore. They spoke of days when the water was unusually clear, allowing them to peer down into the green gloom and glimpse the outlines of walls, the curves of pillars, and the long straight lines of masonry that nature does not produce. They lived in a world where the boundary between the mythic past and the physical present was thin, where the ground beneath their boats was paved with the history of a forgotten empire. As the centuries passed, the legend of the 7 pagodas drifted into the realm of the lost civilization, tropes that fascinate the modern mind. It was grouped with Atlantis or the sunken lands of Lemuria, stories that speak to our deep-seated fear of the sea's power to erase us. We find a strange comfort in these tales, perhaps because they suggest that the world is much older and more mysterious than our maps allow. We look at the vast expanse of deep time and realize that our recorded history is but a thin layer of dust on a very old shelf. In the context of archaeology, we often rely on radiocarbon dating to pin down the moments when a civilization flourished or fell. By measuring the decay of carbon isotopes in organic remains, we can build a timeline of human activity. But stone does not speak the language of carbon. A granite block carved 1,000 years ago looks much the same as one carved 2,000 years ago once the salt air has had its way with the surface. This creates a vacuum of knowledge, a space where folklore and science must eventually meet. The fishermen's stories were a form of oral stratigraphy, a layering of memories that preserved a truth the scholars couldn't yet see. The skepticism of the academic world was not born of malice, but of a commitment to the visible. Without physical evidence, the 6 sunken temples remained ghosts. They were part of what some researchers call the shadow geography of the ancient world, places that exist in the collective memory but have no coordinates in the physical world. For hundreds of years the shore temple stood alone, battered by the salt spray, its intricate carvings of lions and deities slowly softening under the touch of the wind, becoming more like the sea-worn rocks around it every day. It seemed that the secret of the 7 pagodas would remain forever buried in the silt, a beautiful lie told to children to explain the loneliness of the coast. And yet, the earth has a way of revealing its secrets when we least expect it. The forces that buried the city are the same forces that can unearth it. The ocean, which acts as a vast, dark library of human history, does not always keep its doors locked. Sometimes the pressure of the deep shifts. Sometimes the very foundations of the world tremble, and the veil that separates the myth from the reality is pulled back, if only for a few terrifying moments. As the years moved into the modern era, the legend of the jealous god and the drowning city began to feel more like a metaphor for the environmental changes we see today. We talk about the Younger Dryas, a period of abrupt climate change nearly 12,000 years ago, and how it might have caused sea levels to rise and swallow coastal settlements around the globe. While the 7 pagodas are much younger than that prehistoric era, they represent the same fundamental tension between human permanence and the fluid, changing nature of our planet. We build in stone because we want to last forever, but we build on sand, and the sand is always moving. The people of Mahabalipuram continue to look out at the waves, watching the white foam break over the hidden reefs. They knew that the sea was not just a body of water, but a guardian. They knew that somewhere out there, under the weight of 1,000 years of tides, the other 6 temples were waiting. They were not gone. They were merely resting, held in the cold embrace of the bay, protected from the sun and the wind by the very element that had claimed them. The myth was not a story of an ending, but a story of a long underwater silence. And so, the legend persisted, a quiet hum beneath the noise of the modern world. It survived the arrival of the steamship, the telegraph, and the airplane. It survived the transition from a kingdom to a colony to a nation. It remained a mystery that felt almost comfortable in its unsolvability. No one could have predicted that the answer would come through a moment of global tragedy, that a tremor thousands of miles away would act as the key to the lock. The sea was about to pull back its tide, and for a few brief minutes the ghosts of the 7 pagodas would finally step out of the myth and back into the light of day. The scent of salt spray and sun-warmed granite hangs heavy in the air of Mahabalipuram, a fragrance that has likely remained unchanged for 1,300 years. To understand the magnitude of what the receding ocean revealed, one must first look at what was left behind on the shore, standing as silent sentinels for over a millennium. These are the monoliths, massive singular stones that seem to have been breathed into existence rather than built. As we walk among the structures known as the Pancha Rathas, or the 5 chariots, the first thing that strikes the mind is a sense of impossible subtraction. In our modern world, we are accustomed to additive architecture. We lay brick upon brick, we pour concrete into molds, we hoist steel beams into the sky. But here, the Pallava craftsmen of the 7th century worked in reverse. They did not build these temples, they found them. They looked at massive, protruding boulders of pinkish-grey granite and saw the sacred forms trapped within. Every pillar, every ornate frieze, and every hollowed-out sanctuary was carved from a single continuous piece of living rock. There are no joints here, no mortar to crumble, no seams to fail. To stand before them is to realize that if you were to somehow lift one of these temples, the entire structure, from the base to the highest finial, would remain a single, solid piece of the earth's crust. And so, we find ourselves contemplating the sheer patience required for such a feat. Imagine the rhythmic tap of a copper chisel against granite, a sound echoing through the humid coastal air, day after day, year after year. The engineers had no room for error. A single misplaced strike, a fracture in the stone that ran too deep, and the entire endeavour would be ruined. They began at the summit of the boulders and worked their way down, peeling back the layers of time and stone to reveal the shapes beneath. This is lithic poetry, a slow, deliberate conversation between the human hand and the bones of the world. The rathas are named after the heroes of the Mahabharata, yet they are not merely monuments to legend. They serve as a vast, open-air laboratory for architectural styles that would later define the temples of southern India. Some mimic the thatched roofs of village huts, frozen forever in stone, while others rise in tiered pyramids that seem to reach for the celestial realms. Between these stone chariots stand life-sized animals, a massive elephant, its skin rendered with such softness that you almost expect to see it breathe, a lion, regal and stern, a bull, resting in eternal patience. These creatures were not carved separately and moved into place. They were born from the same mother rock as the temples themselves, linked by a subterranean umbilical cord of granite that remains buried beneath the shifting sands. Meanwhile, just a short distance away, the mystery deepens as we face one of the largest open-air bas-reliefs in the entire world. It is known as the Descent of the Ganges, or sometimes Arjuna's Penance. It is a canvas of stone nearly 100 feet long and almost 50 feet high, divided down the center by a natural cleft in the rock. When the monsoon rains fall, the water flows down this central fissure, transforming the stone into a living map of a sacred event. The detail here is staggering. A dense tapestry of over 100 individual figures, each one possessing a distinct personality and purpose. We see deities floating on clouds with an effortless grace that defies the weight of the material. We see celestial musicians, hunters, and sage-like figures, lost in meditation. But it is the animals that truly capture the heart. There are monkeys grooming one another with a tenderness that feels strikingly modern. A cat standing on its hind legs in a humorous imitation of a holy man, and a family of elephants led by a majestic patriarch that seems to be marching toward the water's edge. The symbolic meaning of this massive carving is layered in deep time. If it represents the descent of the Ganges, then the central cleft is the river itself, tumbling from the heavens to the earth to purify the souls of the ancestors. It is a story of cosmic balance, of the divine intersecting with the mundane. The figures are not merely decorations, they are witnesses to a bridge being built between the world of men and the world of the gods. Yet, some scholars look at the same stone and see the story of Arjuna, the great archer, performing a grueling penance to earn a powerful weapon. Both interpretations exist simultaneously, held in place by the unwavering permanence of the granite. As the years passed and the sand began to reclaim the lower portions of these carvings, the technical mastery of the Pallava Dynasty became a whisper of the past. We often speak of the lost techniques of antiquity, a phrase that suggests a sudden disappearance of knowledge. In reality, it is often a slow fading, a shift in priorities as empires rise and fall, but the sheer scale of the work at Mahabalipuram suggests a society that possessed a profound understanding of geology and physics. They understood how to read the grain of the rock, how to manage the stresses of such immense weight, and how to create a sense of lightness in a medium that is inherently heavy. One cannot help but wonder, if this is what they achieved on the shore, what were they capable of building further out? The bas-reliefs and the monolithic chariots are breathtaking, but they feel like part of a larger unfinished sentence. There is a sense of preparation here, as if the entire coast was being transformed into a sacred city that was meant to stretch far beyond the reach of the tide. The animal carvings, the celestial figures, and the hollowed-out caves are all oriented toward the sea, as if waiting for a guest who never arrived. or perhaps acknowledging a neighbor who has since moved away. The concept of deep time is often difficult for the human mind to grasp. We measure our lives in decades, our histories in centuries, but the granite of Mahabalipuram was formed millions of years ago, cooling slowly beneath the Earth's surface to create the massive crystals that give it its strength. The Pallava carvers were merely the latest in a long line of forces to shape this stone, following the slow grind of tectonic plates and the relentless erosion of the wind. When we look at the intricate details of a goddess's crown or the curve of an elephant's trunk, we are seeing a brief moment of human intention etched into a material that belongs to the ages. This brings us back to the limits of our knowledge. Archaeology often relies on stratigraphy, the study of rock layers to determine the chronological order of events. By examining the layers of sediment that have accumulated around these monoliths, we can piece together a timeline of when they were carved and when they were abandoned. But the sea is a chaotic librarian. It mixes the layers, washes away the evidence, and hides the truth beneath meters of silt and salt. The Younger Dryas, a period of abrupt climate change and rising sea levels over 10,000 years ago, is often cited by those who believe these ruins are far older than the 7th century. While mainstream science places the Seven Pagodas firmly in the Pallava era, the sheer perfection of the engineering invites a sense of wonder that transcends dates on a page. And so, the monoliths stand in a state of perpetual tension. They are heavy enough to ground us in the reality of the earth, yet their artistry is ethereal enough to make us question the boundaries of what was possible in the ancient world. They are the visible portion of a much larger story, a story that was partially erased by the very ocean that now laps at their feet. As the sun begins to cast long golden shadows across the face of the descent of the Ganges, the figures seem to stir. The stone monkeys appear to move in the periphery of your vision, and the elephants seem to take a collective step toward the surf. It was this same surf that, in the early years of the 21st century, would finally give up its secrets. The myths of the Seven Pagodas had been dismissed by many as the romantic exaggerations of sailors and travellers, stories told to pass the time during long voyages. But the ocean has a long memory, and it does not always keep what it takes. The tragedy of the tsunami was a moment of profound destruction, but in its wake, it left behind a revelation that would change our understanding of this coast forever. The sea pulled back its veil, and for a few minutes the world saw what lay beneath the waves, not just sand and coral, but the unmistakable shapes of walls, of pillars, and of a city that had refused to be forgotten. The scent of sandalwood and salt air mingles here, a fragrance that has drifted across these waters for nearly 2,000 years. To understand why the sea might hide a city, we must first understand why the city was built at the very edge of the world's reach. Mahabalipuram was never a lonely outpost or a secluded monastic retreat. It was a beating heart, a central lung through which the Pallava Empire breathed in the wealth of the known world. In the 7th and 8th centuries, this coastline was the primary gateway between the Indian subcontinent and the vast horizons of the east. It was a place where the land did not end, but rather where the possibilities of the water began. As we look out over the modern surf, we must imagine the horizon as it once appeared, crowded with the silhouettes of massive wooden hulls and the snapping of linen sails. These were the merchant vessels of the Pallava Dynasty, great seafaring ships that navigated by the stars and the seasonal shifts of the monsoon winds. They did not merely hug the coast, they struck out across the Bay of Bengal, bound for the kingdoms of Srivijaya in modern-day Indonesia, the thriving ports of Cambodia, and the distant, sophisticated markets of the Tang dynasty in China. This was a hub of global trade long before the concept of a global economy was ever written down. The docks would have been a chaotic, beautiful symphony of languages, the sharp tones of Middle Chinese, the rhythmic flow of Sanskrit, and the local Tamil dialects all clashing and blending over the cries of gulls and the thud of heavy crates hitting the stone piers. The marketplace was a sensory tapestry, woven with threads from every corner of the map. Traders from the interior brought fine cotton textiles, dyed in vibrant indigos and madder reds, while others offered precious gemstones unearthed from the deep mines of the Deccan Plateau. In exchange, the ships arriving from the east brought back porcelain that felt like frozen silk, aromatic resins, and spices so rare they were worth their weight in gold. But the most significant cargo carried through this port was not something that could be weighed or measured in a ledger. It was the weightless, invisible transport of ideas. Mahabalipuram served as a cultural crucible, a place where the spiritual architecture of India was refined and then exported across the waves. It was from these very shores that the seeds of Hinduism and Buddhism were carried to Southeast Asia, eventually blooming into the stone wonders of Angkor Wat and Borobudur. When we look at the carvings here, the delicate features of the deities and the fluid grace of the celestial dancers, we are looking at the prototype for an entire continent's artistic soul. The port was a bridge between worlds, a point of departure for monks, scholars, and architects who carried their scrolls and their visions to new lands, and as they left, they looked back at the shoreline, seeing the towering stone temples shining like white beacons against the dark green of the palms. Some say the legendary Seven Pagodas were built so tall and so close to the tide specifically to serve as landmarks, a final shimmering goodbye to those braving the deep and a welcoming light for those returning from years at sea. Life in the city moved with the rhythm of the tides and the arrival of the fleets. Beneath the shadow of the great granite boulders, the streets were lined with workshops where artisans labored over ivory and bronze. There was a constant hum of activity, the clinking of metal, the rhythmic chipping of stone masons, and the low chanting from the nearby shrines. It was a place of immense sophistication, where the elite of the Pallava court mingled with foreign dignitaries in gardens cooled by sophisticated hydraulic systems. They lived in a world that felt permanent, a civilization carved from the very bones of the earth, yet they were always aware of the ocean's proximity. They respected its power, building their most sacred structures on the high ground, or so it seemed. But time has a way of blurring the line between the shore and the deep. As the centuries drifted by, the busy markets fell silent, and the great ships stopped coming. Perhaps the harbours silted up, or perhaps the political tides shifted to other capitals, leaving the stone lions and the silent gods to watch over an empty sea. As the people moved away, the ocean began its slow, patient reclamation. We often think of geological change as something that happens over millions of years, but the history of this coast suggests something more volatile, a delicate balance that can be upended in a single night of storm and shadow. The ancient texts and the accounts of early European travellers speak of a city so grand that its reflection could be seen for miles. They described a skyline of multiple temples, not just the one that stands today, but a sequence of towers that marched right into the surf. For a long time, modern historians viewed these accounts with a certain academic skepticism. They were dismissed as the exaggerations of sailors or the embellishments of local folklore, the kind of myths that grow like barnacles on the hull of history. Without physical evidence, the Seven Pagodas remained a ghost story, a beautiful dream of a drowned kingdom that existed only in the songs of the local fishermen. Yet the ocean does not always keep its secrets forever. It breathes, it shifts, and occasionally it gasps. When we look at the stratigraphy, the layering of soil and sediment that acts as a diary of the earth, we see hints of sudden changes. We see evidence of rising sea levels and the slow subsidence of the land, a process where the coastal shelf gradually sinks beneath the weight of the water. This is deep time in action, the quiet, relentless movement of the planet that mocks the permanence of human architecture. We are left to wonder how many other bustling marketplaces, how many other libraries and homes now lie beneath the silt, preserved in the cold, dark silence of the Bay of Bengal. The mystery of Mahabalipuram is not just in what was lost, but in how it was remembered. The fishermen of the village have passed down stories for generations, stories of their nets getting snagged on carved stone deep underwater, of seeing the glint of a golden finial during the lowest of spring tides. They spoke of the old temple that lived beneath the waves, a place where the fish swam through doorways meant for kings. While the world above changed, while empires rose and fell, and while the very language of the land evolved, the memory of the drowned city remained anchored in the minds of those who lived by the water. They knew what the maps did not show. They understood that the beach was not a border, but a veil. The scratching of a quill against parchment in the 13th century was a quiet sound, yet it carried the weight of a world slowly expanding its horizons. As the medieval era reached its zenith, the stories of the drowned temples began to drift across the ocean, no longer confined to the oral traditions of local fishermen, but finding their way into the journals of men who travelled by the stars. Among these was Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant whose accounts of the East often blurred the line between the observed and the imagined. While his mentions of the region are brief, they carry the unmistakable scent of a legend already solidified. He and those who followed him spoke of a place known as the Seven Pagodas, a name that would eventually haunt the maps of the Western world for centuries. To these early travellers, the coast of Mahabalipuram was not merely a destination, but a landmark of the impossible, a shoreline where the architecture of man seemed to surrender to the authority of the tide. The name Seven Pagodas itself is a curious relic of this period. It suggests a visual reality that the travellers believed they saw, or perhaps what they were told they should see. When the first European explorers and cartographers arrived, their eyes were untrained for the complexities of Dravidian architecture, yet they were struck by the silhouettes rising against the horizon. They saw the shore temple standing defiant against the salt spray, and they assumed it was but one of many. Their journals describe a skyline dominated by towering structures, some of which seem to shimmer and shift in the heat haze of the Bay of Bengal. There is a persistent sense in these early travelogues that the land was playing tricks on the light. They recorded the existence of 7 great temples, yet even then, as they walked the sands, they could only account for 1 or 2 on dry ground. The others, they were told, had already been claimed by the sea, their copper-clad domes still visible beneath the translucent green waves when the water was calm and the sun was high. As we look back through the lens of deep time, we must wonder if these medieval sailors were witnessing the final, lingering moments of a city's visibility before it slipped forever into the silt. The 13th and 14th centuries were a time of transition, a period when the great port of Mahabalipuram was beginning to feel the slow, heavy hand of geological change. The coastline was not a fixed line on a map, but a breathing thing. As the years passed, the very earth seemed to tilt or the waters to rise, a process of coastal erosion and subsidence that happens so slowly it is almost imperceptible to a single human life, yet over generations it reshapes the world. The bustling harbour, which had once welcomed merchant ships from the Roman Empire and the distant reaches of China, began to lose its depth. The silt brought down by distant rivers and the relentless pounding of the monsoon surges began to choke the inlets. The grand stone piers, where once the wealth of nations was unloaded, were slowly buried under layers of fine white sand. The cartographers of the time, working in the dim light of European scriptoriums, began to mark this spot with a particular reverence. On the Catalan Atlas of 1375 and in the later maps of the Renaissance, the Seven Pagodas appear as a vital navigational landmark. To a sailor, these were not just religious monuments, they were beacons. They were the last familiar shapes before the vast, unknown emptiness of the southern Indian Ocean. But even as the maps grew more precise, the physical reality of the site was fading. The decline of the port was a quiet tragedy of geography. As the coastline shifted, the city that had thrived on maritime trade found itself stranded, too far from the deep water to remain a hub of commerce, yet too close to the encroaching waves to remain safe. The grand stone staircases that once led down to the water now led into the surf, and the intricate carvings of gods and celestial beings began to be smoothed away by the constant, abrasive touch of wind-blown sand. There is a certain melancholy in imagining these medieval explorers standing on the deck of a wooden carrack, peering through the mist at a shoreline that was already becoming a ghost of itself. They wrote of fine and noble cities and temples of great height, but their descriptions often feel like echoes of a glory that had passed its peak. They were capturing the twilight of the Pallava legacy. The maritime empire that had projected its power across the Bay of Bengal was long gone, replaced by new dynasties and new priorities, leaving the stone sentinels of Mahabalipuram to face the ocean alone. The decline was not a sudden catastrophe, but a gradual withdrawal, a slow retreat of human presence as the environment became increasingly hostile. The salt air ate at the granite, and the shifting dunes swallowed the smaller shrines, leaving only the tallest and most robust structures to tell the story of what had been lost. During this era, the Seven Pagodas became more than a geographical location. They became a symbol of the transience of human endeavor. To the medieval mind, obsessed with the rise and fall of kingdoms, the sight of a half-submerged temple was a powerful memento mori, a reminder that even the most solid stone must eventually bow to the elements. The travelers spoke of the old city with a mixture of awe and skepticism. Some dismissed the stories of underwater streets as the exaggerations of locals, while others were so convinced of their truth that they spent hours staring into the depths, hoping to catch a glimpse of a reflected column or a drowned courtyard. This was the birth of the myth as we know it today, the moment when history began to dissolve into legend and the physical ruins began to take on a supernatural significance. As the 15th century turned into the 16th, the records become even more fragmented. The port had become a backwater, a place of memory rather than activity. The great stone elephants and lions that guarded the shore were now the companions of lonely hermits and passing nomads, rather than the witnesses to royal processions. The shifting sands had created a new landscape, one where the boundaries between the land and the sea were perpetually blurred. It is during this long, quiet stretch of time that the true extent of the city's footprint was lost to common knowledge. The maps continued to show the Seven Pagodas, but the people who drew them had often never seen the place for themselves. They were copying the work of those who came before, perpetuating a vision of a city that was increasingly being reclaimed by the earth and the tide. We must consider the silence of the archives during these middle centuries. While the world was preoccupied with the age of discovery and the shifting of global power, the stones of Mahabalipuram remained in their patient vigil. The tides came in and went out, twice a day, every day, for hundreds of years, each cycle carrying away a few more grains of stone, a few more details of the carvings. The old temple beneath the waves became a secret kept by the ocean, protected by the very water that had stolen it. It sat in the darkness of the seabed, a silent witness to the passage of time, while above, the world forgot the specifics of its construction and the names of the kings who had commissioned it. The mystery was deepening, layering itself like the sediment on the ocean floor, waiting for a moment when the sea would decide to pull back the veil and reveal what had been hidden for nearly 1,000 years. The rhythm of the Bay of Bengal is a relentless, rhythmic pulse, a heartbeat that has measured the life of the Coromandel coast for eons. To look upon the shoreline of Mahabalipuram today is to see a delicate balance between granite and brine, but for the geologists who study these sands, the coast is not a fixed line, it is a moving frontier. Over the last millennium, the geography of this edge of the world has undergone a quiet, slow-motion transformation, a process known as coastal erosion, where the sea patiently reclaims the land, grain by grain. It is a geological dialogue where the water always has the final word. As the centuries slipped away, the sea began to move inland, driven by the subtle shifts in tectonic plates and the rising levels of the global oceans. Geologists suggest that this region of India sits upon a shelf that has experienced gradual subsidence, a slow sinking of the Earth's crust that, while invisible to the naked eye over a single human lifetime, becomes a profound force across 10 generations. Imagine the city as it once was, with its grand stone temples standing proudly on dry land, surrounded by bustling markets and the shade of tropical trees. Then, imagine the water creeping closer, year by year, until the high tide mark reached the very steps of the shrines. Eventually, the salt spray began to pit the intricate carvings of gods and celestial dancers, and the foundations that once felt eternal began to settle into the softening mud. This was not a sudden catastrophe like a volcanic eruption or a great fire, but a patient, encroaching greyness. One by one, the outer structures of the legendary Seven Pagodas began to surrender. The furthest temples, those built closest to the ancient harbour, were likely the first to go. As the waves battered their bases, the sand beneath them was scoured away, leaving the heavy granite blocks to tilt and slide into the surf. To a resident of the 8th century, this might have seemed like a temporary misfortune, but to the perspective of deep time, it was the beginning of a total erasure. The sea does not just flood, it consumes. It pulls the terrestrial world into its depths and covers it with a blanket of silt and kelp, hiding the work of men beneath the indifferent biology of the reef. As these buildings were submerged, the physical reality of the city began to drift into the realm of the ethereal. The Seven Pagodas, once a navigational landmark for sailors from as far away as Rome and China, began to shrink in the eyes of the world. Where there were once 7 distinct silhouettes against the horizon, there were soon only 5, then 3, until finally only one solitary temple remained standing on the shore, the one we now call the Shore Temple. The others had become ghosts, resting in the twilight zone of the shallow shelf, their spires perhaps visible only during the lowest of spring tides or in the terrifying troughs of a passing storm. This transition from a physical location to a ghost story is a fascinating evolution in human memory. When a landmark disappears, the stories told about it begin to change shape. The eyewitness accounts of the grand city were replaced by the tall tales of mariners, who spoke of shimmering golden domes seen through the clear water on calm days, or of bells that could still be heard tolling beneath the waves during a full moon. The Seven Pagodas became a title of longing, a phrase that carried the weight of something lost. In the minds of the local fishing communities, the submerged temples were no longer just buildings, they were the residences of spirits, or perhaps the remnants of a divine kingdom that had been cursed by the gods for its vanity. The history of the coast became a tapestry of myth, where the line between what was built by the Pallava kings and what was imagined by the storytellers became inextricably blurred. We see this often in the study of lost civilizations, a process where the stratigraphy, or the layering of historical evidence, is overwritten by the mythography, the layering of legend. In Mahabalipuram, the salt air seemed to dissolve the hard facts of the past, leaving behind a haunting atmosphere of mystery. The city hadn't just moved, it had ascended into the cultural subconscious. Scientists who look at the bathymetry of this area, the study of the underwater topography, note that the seabed here drops off in a series of terraces. These terraces are like the steps of a giant staircase leading down into the dark. Each step represents a different era of the coastline's history, a moment when the sea level paused before rising again. It is within these hidden folds of the earth that the missing pagodas were thought to reside. For centuries, mainstream scholars remained skeptical, often dismissing the idea of multiple, submerged temples as a simple exaggeration of the one surviving structure. They pointed to the lack of radiocarbon dating evidence, a method of measuring the decay of carbon isotopes to determine the age of organic materials, though, of course, stone itself cannot be carbon dated. Only the shells and coral that grow upon the stone can tell us when the sea arrived to claim it. And so, the legend of the Seven Pagodas settled into the silt of history. It became a story told to children at bedtime, a curious footnote in the journals of European travellers like Marco Polo or the later British explorers who wondered why the locals insisted on a number that didn't match the reality of the shore. The world moved on. Empires rose and fell in the interior of the subcontinent. The steam engine was invented, the first telegraph lines were strung across the plains, and still the ocean kept its secret. The submerged city was a silent, drowned kingdom, its courtyards filled with schools of silver fish instead of priests, its altars covered in the soft, swaying fronds of sea anemones. There is a specific kind of silence that accompanies a place that has been forgotten by time. It is not the absence of sound, but the presence of a deep, heavy stillness. Beneath the waves of Mahabalipuram, this stillness reigned for nearly 1,000 years. The granite did not decay as wood or bone would. It simply waited. It endured the grinding of the sand and the slow accumulation of calcium from the sea life that made the ruins their home. To the fish and the crustaceans, these were not temples. They were merely rocks, curiously straight-edged and unnaturally smooth, providing nooks and crannies to hide from predators. Meanwhile, on the dry land, the surviving shore temple stood as a lonely sentinel. It bore the brunt of the wind and the spray, its carving softening until the faces of the gods became featureless masks of stone. It was as if the temple was mourning its lost brothers, standing on the edge of the world and looking out over the water where they had vanished. Travellers would visit and marvel at its resilience, unaware that they were looking at only the final paragraph of a much longer, much grander story. The encroaching sea had done more than just hide the architecture. It had shifted the context of the entire landscape, turning a bustling port into a place of quiet, scholarly contemplation and folk mystery. As the years passed into the 19th and 20th centuries, the Seven Pagodas were firmly categorized as a lost city myth, akin to Atlantis or the sunken lands of Lyonesse. It was a romantic idea, but one that few serious historians expected to be verified. The limits of what we know are often defined by the tools we have to see with, and for a long time, the murky waters of the Bay of Bengal were an impenetrable curtain. The sediment kicked up by the heavy surf made diving difficult and visibility poor. The ocean seemed determined to keep its veil drawn tight, until a moment of geological violence, centuries in the making, would finally force the sea to reveal what it had stolen. The weight of forgotten ages is heavy, but it is also fragile. It only takes one shift in the earth, one withdrawal of the tide, to bring the past crashing back into the present. We often think of the earth as a solid, permanent thing, but in the context of deep time, the land is as fluid as the water. The submergence of the city was a slow, graceful descent into the dark, 1,000-year sleep that was never meant to be interrupted. But the ocean is a restless keeper of records, and eventually every secret must come to light. The ink on a page has a certain kind of permanence, but it is nothing compared to the endurance of a story whispered from a grandfather to a grandson on a salt-sprayed shore. For centuries, the residents of Mahabalipuram spoke of a line of magnificent temples that once marched along the coast, a golden chain of architecture that had been broken by the sea's insatiable hunger. To the local fishermen, this was not a matter of myth, but a matter of navigation. They knew where the water grew strangely shallow, where their nets might snag on something jagged and unnatural far beneath the surface. But to the Western mind, arriving with the expansion of the British East India Company, these stories were treated as charming curiosities, the colourful fabrications of a culture obsessed with the legendary. In the year 1798, a man named John Goldingham, a mathematician and astronomer serving as the first official astronomer at the Madras Observatory, turned his gaze away from the stars and toward the shifting sands of the Coromandel coast. Goldingham was a man of precision, a man who dealt in coordinates and measurable truths, yet he found himself captivated by the oral traditions of the local villagers. He sat with the elders, listening as they described a city of 7 pagodas, 6 of which had been swallowed by the waves in a single cataclysmic event, leaving only the shore temple to stand as a lonely sentinel against the tides. Goldingham was among the first to formalize these accounts in writing, recording the persistent belief that the ruins of a great civilization lay just beyond the reach of the low tide. He looked out at the surf, noting how the waves broke with a peculiar violence in certain spots, as if tripping over the ghosts of walls and towers hidden in the haze. As the 19th century dawned, the British presence in India shifted from mere trade to a deep, often intrusive desire to categorize and map the entire subcontinent. This was the era of the Great Trigonometrical Survey, a time when the British sought to pin down the physical world with chains and theodolites. And yet, the sunken city of Mahabalipuram remained an elusive ghost in their ledgers. Early colonial explorers made tentative attempts to map what they could see from the surface. They would row small boats out into the bay when the water was calm, peering through the emerald depths, hoping to catch a glimpse of the carved granite that the locals insisted was there. Some claimed to see long, straight lines that looked suspiciously like foundations. Others saw only the undulating shadows of kelp and the shifting patterns of silt. It was a frustrating pursuit, a search for a needle in a haystack, where the haystack was made of liquid and the needle was made of stone. Meanwhile, back in the libraries of London and the colonial offices of Calcutta, a different kind of tide was rising, the tide of academic skepticism. As the 19th century progressed, the field of history was becoming increasingly professionalized, and with that professionalization came a rigid adherence to the visible and the documented. To the Victorian historian, if a ruin could not be touched, measured, and photographed, it essentially did not exist. The accounts provided by Goldingham and his contemporaries began to be viewed through a lens of colonial condescension. The 7 pagodas were dismissed as a poetic exaggeration, a folk memory of the existing shore temple that had been inflated by time and the human tendency toward the spectacular. The skeptics argued that the geology of the region did not support the idea of a sudden submergence. They looked at the granite cliffs and the stable coastline and concluded that the sea level had remained relatively constant for thousands of years. They spoke of the lack of stratigraphy, the study of rock layers and their ages that would indicate a sunken city. In their view, the underwater ruins were nothing more than natural rock formations, carved into strange shapes by the relentless action of the ocean over millions of years. This was the limit of their science. They could not conceive of a world where the sea could rise or the land could fall with enough speed to preserve a city's skeleton. They were trapped in a linear view of time, one that left little room for the cyclical destructions described in Hindu cosmology. The search for the truth became a battle between the map and the memory. On one side were the surveyors, with their charts that showed nothing but empty blue water beyond the shoreline. On the other side were the locals, who continued to tell stories of the bells that could be heard tolling beneath the waves during great storms. To the British antiquarians, these were superstitions, a word often used to dismiss knowledge that does not fit into a pre-existing framework. They failed to realize that oral tradition is often a remarkably accurate vessel for deep time, a way for a community to carry a trauma or a triumph across 1,000 years when paper and ink would have long since rotted away. As the decades slipped by, the Seven Pagodas faded from the forefront of archaeological inquiry. They became a footnote in travelogues, a romantic mystery for poets, rather than a serious subject for scientists. The skepticism of the 19th century acted as a thick layer of dust, settling over the story and obscuring the evidence that sat just a few hundred yards offshore. The experts of the day were so confident in their geological permanence that they stopped looking altogether. They forgot that the Earth is not a static stage, but a living, breathing entity that undergoes massive shifts on scales that dwarf a human lifetime. They ignored the possibility of the Younger Dryas, a period of abrupt climate change and rising sea levels that occurred over 12,000 years ago, or even more recent seismic events that could have tilted the shelf of the subcontinent. And so, the sunken city remained in its watery grave, protected by the very skepticism that sought to deny it. The ocean continued its slow work, encrusting the granite with barnacles and smoothing the sharp edges of the carvings with the gentle friction of sand. The fish swam through doorways that had once seen the passage of kings, and the currents swept through halls where incense had once burned. For over 200 years, the academic world agreed that the Seven Pagodas were a myth, a beautiful, haunting dream of a lost world that never truly was. But the sea is a patient librarian. It holds its books tightly, waiting for the right moment to open them. It waits for the wind to shift, for the earth to tremble, and for the hubris of man to be washed away by the sheer, undeniable force of the truth. The mystery was not gone. It was merely resting, tucked away in the deep time of the Indian Ocean, waiting for a day when the water would finally pull back the curtain. The air on the morning of the 26th of December, 2004, possessed a quality that many would later struggle to name. A stillness so profound it felt as though the atmosphere itself had reached a state of perfect, glassy equilibrium. Along the coast of Tamil Nadu, the world was waking up in shades of soft amber and pale blue. The Bay of Bengal was a mirror, its surface barely disturbed by the rhythmic, sleepy pulse of the tide. In Mahabalipuram, the shore temple stood in its usual silent vigil, its weathered granite faces catching the first light of a sun that seemed, at least for those first few hours, like any other that had risen over the Coromandel coast for 13 centuries. There is a specific kind of quiet that precedes a great shifting of the earth, a suspension of the natural order where the birds fall silent and the wind holds its breath. It is as if the landscape is aware of the tectonic tension humming deep beneath the crust, 1,000 miles away in the dark trenches of the Indian Ocean. The residents of the coastal villages move through their morning rituals with a sense of peace, unaware that the floor of the sea had already ruptured, sending a massive displacement of energy racing through the deep water at the speed of a jet aircraft. But before the water arrives in its terrifying fullness, it often performs a strange and haunting trick, a withdrawal that feels like the earth taking a deep, sudden gasp of air. As the morning progressed, the people standing on the shore witnessed something that defied the logic of their lifetimes. The horizon did not move toward them. Instead, the sea began to vanish. It did not merely ebb away as it does during a low tide. It retreated with a supernatural speed, pulling back hundreds of meters, then a kilometer, exposing a seabed that had been hidden from human eyes for 1,000 years. The wet sand glistened in the morning light, revealing a landscape that was never meant to be seen. A graveyard of shells, silt, and secrets. In those fleeting, surreal moments, the myth of the Seven Pagodas ceased to be a story told to children and became a physical reality rising from the muck. Eyewitnesses, some of whom were fishermen who had spent their entire lives navigating these waters, stood frozen on the newly revealed ground. They spoke later of seeing long, straight rows of massive rocks, stones that did not look like the jagged, irregular outcrops of a natural reef. These were different. They were sharp-edged and deliberate. They described what looked like the tops of walls, the outlines of fallen structures, and the unmistakable geometry of human hands. It was as if the ocean had suddenly decided to return what it had stolen in the 8th century, pulling back the heavy blue curtain to show the world that the legends were true, that the shore temple was not a solitary monument, but the lone survivor of a much grander assembly. The sight was described as both beautiful and deeply unsettling. One resident recalled seeing a series of large, squared blocks emerging from the surf, arranged in a way that suggested a grand boulevard or a perimeter wall of a temple complex. Others saw the dark, barnacle-encrusted shapes of what appeared to be statues, half buried in the silt, their features softened by centuries of salt and current, but their presence undeniable. For a few minutes, the city of the Seven Pagodas was no longer a ghost. It was a skeleton, bleached by the sun and dripping with the brine of deep time. The sea had pulled back so far that the very foundations of a lost world were laid bare, offering a glimpse into a history that mainstream archaeology had long relegated to the realm of poetic exaggeration. This phenomenon, known to geologists as a drawdown, is a rare and deceptive prelude to a tsunami. But in the context of Mahabalipuram, it served as a momentary bridge between the present and the prehistoric. It was a brief window into the stratigraphy of the shoreline, a term archaeologists use to describe the layering of time and material that builds up over centuries. Usually, to see these layers, one must dig through the earth with brushes and trowels, but here the Indian Ocean had performed a massive, violent excavation in a matter of seconds. The rocks that appeared were described as being arranged in perfectly straight lines, a detail that haunted the survivors long after the water returned. Nature rarely works in straight lines. It prefers the curve, the fractal, and the chaotic. To see a line of stone stretching out into the deep is to see the signature of a civilization. These were the remnants of the Pallava Dynasty's ambition, or perhaps something even older, structures that had been submerged during a period of rising sea levels, or perhaps dragged down by a similar cataclysm in the distant past. As the people stared out at these emerging ruins, the silence of the morning grew even heavier. There was a sense of awe, a realization that the ground beneath their feet was merely the roof of a much older house. But the sea is not a kind librarian. It does not leave its books open for long. The withdrawal was merely the gathering of strength. Even as the residents marveled at the stone walls and the mysterious shapes appearing in the distance, a low rumble began to grow on the horizon, a sound like 1,000 freight trains moving across the water. The dark line of the returning sea began to swell, masking the ruins once more as it surged back toward the land with a force that would reshape the coastline forever. The ruins were visible for only a few minutes, a heartbeat in the scale of deep time, before they were swallowed again by the churning, debris-filled surge of the tsunami. When the water finally receded for good, and the survivors began the long, painful process of searching through the wreckage, they found that the landscape had been altered in more ways than one. The sheer power of the waves had scoured the seabed, washing away centuries of sand and silt that had previously buried the ruins. While the tsunami brought tragedy and destruction to the living, it also acted as a great unearthing for the dead. As the salt spray settled and the mud began to dry, the people of Mahabalipuram looked toward the shore and realized that the sea had left behind more than just debris. It had left behind proof. Near the shore temple, where the waves had hammered against the granite for hours, new shapes were now visible even at normal tide levels. Large carved lions, elephants, and peacocks. Granite sculptures that had been hidden under the sand for generations were now sitting out in the open air, as if they had just been placed there by the hands of ancient masons. The long, straight rows of rocks that the witnesses had seen during the retreat of the water were now partially visible during the lowest tides of the month. The myth had been touched. It had been seen by hundreds of pairs of eyes, and the mystery could no longer be dismissed as mere folklore. As the days passed, and the immediate shock of the disaster began to fade into a long period of mourning and rebuilding, the scientific community began to descend upon the site. They came with sonar, with diving gear, and with a newfound respect for the local traditions. They realized that the mourning of the receding sea was not just a natural disaster, but a profound archaeological event. It was a reminder that our understanding of the past is often limited by the very environment we inhabit, that we walk along the edges of vast, sunken archives, waiting for the earth to tremble just enough to show us what we have forgotten. The Seven Pagodas were no longer just a haunting dream of a lost world. They were a physical challenge, a series of granite questions rising from the surf, demanding to be answered. For a few suspended moments on that December morning in 2004, the laws of the ocean seemed to reverse themselves. The water did not merely recede, it vanished, pulled back by an invisible gargantuan hand toward the horizon, leaving the seabed exposed and gasping in the sudden light. Those who stood on the shore at Mahabalipuram witnessed a sight that defied the logic of a lifetime spent by the surf. The wet sand, usually a flat and featureless expanse, was suddenly revealed to be a graveyard of monumental proportions. As the sea retreated nearly 500 meters, the foam and spray cleared to show long, straight lines of masonry cutting through the silt. There, rising from the muck of centuries, were the foundations of a world that had been relegated to the realm of folklore. The witnesses spoke of massive granite blocks, their edges still sharp despite the relentless grinding of the tides. These were not the rounded, chaotic shapes of natural reef or rock, but the deliberate, calculated geometry of human ambition. They saw walls of dressed stone, laid out in perfect courses, stretching toward the deep. Some described the sight of a large stone lion, carved with the same fierce grace as those guarding the shore temple on dry land, emerging from the receding froth like a guardian returning from a long exile. For those few minutes, the myth of the Seven Pagodas was no longer a story told by grandfathers or a curiosity noted by colonial travellers. It was a physical reality, a heavy, silent presence of stone and shadow that had been hiding just beneath the waves, separated from the living world by only a few fathoms of blue. The granite was dark and slick, coated in the pale crust of barnacles and the green velvet of deep-sea moss, yet the craftsmanship was unmistakable. There were visible remains of what appeared to be a collapsed temple complex, square platforms that once supported massive pillars and long, straight corridors of stone that suggested a grand architectural plan. The retreat of the water had opened a brief, shimmering window into the past, allowing the sun to touch surfaces that had not felt its warmth in perhaps 1,000 years. It was a moment of profound cognitive dissonance, a realization that the ground beneath our feet is rarely as solid as we imagine, and that the maps we draw are often missing their most important features. In the silence of that retreat, before the ocean gathered its strength to return with a roar, the observers felt the weight of deep time, They were looking at the bones of a civilization that had been swallowed by the rising tides of the post-glacial world, or perhaps a sudden ancient cataclysm that mirrored the one they were currently experiencing. In archaeology, we often look for stratigraphy, the layers of soil and debris that act as a timeline of human occupation, but here, the stratigraphy was liquid. The ocean had acted as a preservative, a cold and dark archive that kept these ruins safe from the erosion of wind and the interference of modern builders. As the water rushed back in to reclaim its secrets, the realization among the survivors and the scholars who arrived later was immediate and staggering. The legends were true. The ancient poems that spoke of a city so beautiful, the gods became jealous and drowned it, were not merely metaphors for the passage of time. They were eyewitness accounts, passed down through generations, warped by the poetic license of the storyteller, but anchored in a terrifying physical event. The granite blocks were the evidence that the Seven Pagodas had once stood as a singular, massive complex, perhaps forming a sacred landscape that stretched far into what is now the Bay of Bengal. The stone walls were thick, designed to withstand the pressures of the ages, and their orientation suggested a sophisticated understanding of the coastline. The exposed ruins hinted at a city that was not merely a collection of shrines, but a bustling port, a hub of maritime trade where the granite of the Pallava kings met the silk and spices of the eastern world. The retreat of the sea had stripped away the veil of mystery, leaving behind a series of granite questions. How far did these ruins extend? What other treasures lay buried in the deeper trenches beyond the reach of a single tide? And most importantly, what does it mean for our understanding of history when a fable is suddenly found to have a foundation of solid rock? The sight of those submerged walls changed the atmosphere of Mahabalipuram forever. The town had always been a place of pilgrimage, but now it became a place of haunting. Every wave that breaks against the shore is now understood to be washing over the rooftops of a forgotten world. We realize now that we are only seeing the very tip of a much larger, much older iceberg of human achievement. The granite blocks, briefly glimpsed in the morning light, serve as a reminder that the ocean is a vast, unread library, and that sometimes the earth must tremble for us to be allowed to read a single page. This brief revelation offered a glimpse into what geologists and archaeologists sometimes call the lost lands. These are the coastal shelves that were dry and habitable during the last glacial maximum, when the sea levels were much lower than they are today. While these specific ruins likely date to the Pallava period of the 7th or 8th century, their presence suggests a much longer relationship between the people of this coast and the encroaching water. The granite remains are a testament to a struggle against the elements, a struggle that the ocean eventually won, leaving us with only the echoes of a drowned majesty. In the immediate wake of the receding tide, the silence that fell over the coast of Mahabalipuram was heavy, thick with the salt of the deep and the weight of 1,000 years of secrets suddenly laid bare. The ocean, having taken so much in its violent upheaval, had also given something back, a glimpse into a reality that many had dismissed as a mere fisherman's yarn. As the waters finally settled into a deceptive calm, the Archaeological Survey of India arrived on the scene, their footsteps heavy on the wet, compacted sand. They did not find the familiar landscape they had studied for decades. Instead, they found a shoreline transformed into a gallery of the impossible. Scattered across the beach, like the broken toys of a giant, were massive blocks of granite, smoothed and shaped by hands that had been still for over 12 centuries. There were walls of stone, thick and resolute, that had been buried beneath the seabed, now standing exposed to the harsh light of the afternoon sun. The archaeologists moved with a quiet reverence, documenting the appearance of a massive stone lion, its features worn, but its posture still regal, emerging from the silt as if it had been waiting for this very moment to breathe again. Nearby, the head of an elephant, carved from a single boulder stared out at the horizon with blank stone eyes, a silent witness to the city that had once surrounded it. These were not random rocks tossed by the storm. These were the deliberate, artistic expressions of the Pallava Dynasty, found in a place where, according to the maps, nothing should have existed but the empty sea. The discovery sent a ripple of quiet shock through the global academic community. For centuries, the legend of the Seven Pagodas had been treated as a charming myth, a bit of local colour to entertain travellers and scholars alike. It was a story of a city so beautiful that the gods grew jealous and drowned it, a story that fit neatly into the category of folklore. But as the survey teams began to clear the debris and map the foundations of these newly revealed structures, the tone of the conversation shifted. The myth was no longer just a story, it was a map. The shift in perspective was profound and immediate. Mainstream history had long maintained that the Shore Temple was a solitary monument, a lonely sentinel on the edge of the world. Yet here was physical proof of a much larger complex, a sprawling urban or religious centre that extended far beyond the modern coastline. The researchers looked out at the waves and realized that the horizon they had always known was a veil, a curtain drawn over a much older, much larger truth. They began to employ the tools of modern science to listen to what these stones were trying to say. They looked at the stratigraphy, the study of the layers of earth and sediment, to understand how long these ruins had been submerged. They searched for signs of the Younger Dryas, that mysterious period of rapid cooling and sea level fluctuations that had reshaped the world's coastlines thousands of years prior, wondering if the foundations of this city were even older than the Pallava carvings that adorned them. As the days turned into weeks, the scale of the find became even more apparent. It wasn't just a few scattered statues. There were long, straight walls made of interlocking stone blocks, suggesting a sophisticated knowledge of engineering designed to withstand the very element that eventually claimed them. The archaeologists spoke of archaeological awakening, a moment when the physical evidence matches the oral tradition so perfectly that the boundaries between history and legend begin to dissolve. They realized that the fishermen who had claimed to see the tops of temples during low tides were not exaggerating. They were the keepers of a collective memory that had survived the rise and fall of empires. The global perspective on Mahabalipuram was forever changed. It was no longer just a site of beautiful ruins. It was a site of profound mystery, a place where the deep time of the Earth's geological shifts met the relatively brief window of human civilization. The questions began to multiply, swirling like the eddies in the tide pools. If these structures were here, what else lay further out, in the deeper, darker waters where the light of the sun cannot reach? The stones washed ashore were merely the prologue to a much longer story. The experts began to discuss the possibility of a massive submerged harbour, a gateway to the east that had once been the beating heart of a maritime empire. They considered the granite remains not as dead matter, but as a living record of a struggle against the encroaching ocean, a struggle that we are only now beginning to understand. And so, the arrival of the Archaeological Survey of India marked the beginning of a new era of exploration, one that required looking beneath the surface of both the water and our own assumptions. The world watched as the mud was scraped away from the ancient carvings, revealing the intricate details of a culture that lived in harmony with the sea until the sea decided otherwise. The legend of the Seven Pagodas had been vindicated, but in its place a much larger mystery had emerged, one that whispered of lost cities and the fragility of everything we build upon the sand. As the sun dipped lower, casting long, dancing shadows across the newly discovered walls, the researchers knew that their work had only just begun. The ocean had pulled back the curtain, but it had not yet told the whole story. It was a patient mystery, one that had waited 1,000 years to be heard and would perhaps wait another 1,000 to be fully understood. The salt-heavy air of the Bay of Bengal carries a specific weight, a humidity that feels like the breath of the ocean itself, moving over the land with a rhythmic, tidal patience. For centuries, the fishermen of Mahabalipuram had spoken of what lay beneath that breath, of stone giants and paved streets that rested in the dark, silent pressure of the deep. But it was not until the waters retreated and surged in 2004 that the whispers turned into a summons that could no longer be ignored. The scientists of the National Institute of Oceanography arrived not with shovels or brushes, but with the tools of a different kind of sight. They brought with them side-scan sonar and sub-bottom profilers, instruments designed to pierce the veil of the murky green water and map the secrets of the seabed through the language of sound. As the research vessels drifted slowly over the undulating waves, the screens on board began to flicker with the ghosts of a forgotten world. They were looking for the Seven Pagodas, the legendary temples that supposedly once lined the shore, 6 of which were said to have been swallowed by a hungry sea. What they found was a landscape that defied the randomness of nature. Beneath the silt and the swaying kelp, the sonar revealed sharp geometric shadows, long straight lines that ran parallel to one another for hundreds of meters. These were not the jagged, chaotic formations of volcanic rock or the soft curves of sandbars. These were walls, massive cyclopean walls made of granite, some rising 2 meters from the ocean floor, standing as silent sentinels in a world without light. As the divers descended, leaving the golden warmth of the Indian sun for the cold, suspended weight of the deep, the reality of the discovery began to take shape through their goggles. They found themselves swimming alongside vast dressed stones, blocks of granite so large and so precisely cut that they seemed to mock the passage of 1,000 years. The divers ran their hands over the surfaces, feeling the rough texture of barnacles and sea growth covering what was once polished masonry. In the dim, filtered light, they discovered flights of stairs, wide ceremonial steps that led nowhere, or perhaps led everywhere, descending deep into the sandy floor as if waiting for a procession of ghosts to climb them once again. The mapping process was a slow, meditative labor. The researchers traced the outlines of these structures, finding that they covered an area of several square kilometers. It was a city layout, a deliberate arrangement of plazas, walls, and what appeared to be the foundations of enormous platforms. The sonar data suggested a complex urban grid, a place where thousands might have once walked, traded, and prayed, now reduced to a series of acoustic echoes. The sheer scale of the ruins hinted at a civilization that possessed not only the architectural ambition to build on such a grand level, but the engineering prowess to move stones weighing several tons through a landscape that was now entirely submerged. In the language of archaeology, this is often a matter of stratigraphy, the study of layers, where the deeper one digs, the further back one travels into the heart of time. But here the layers were horizontal, stretched out across the shelf of the continent. To understand when these stones were last dry, the scientists had to look at the history of the sea itself. They looked for signs of the Younger Dryas, a period of abrupt climate change and rising sea levels that occurred over 11,000 years ago, though many believe these specific ruins date to a more recent, yet still ancient, era of the Pallava Dynasty. The question remains, did the sea rise slowly, a creeping inundation that forced the inhabitants to abandon their homes inch by inch, or was it a sudden, cataclysmic event, a Paleolithic echo of the tsunami that had rediscovered them? The National Institute of Oceanography team documented what appeared to be a massive enclosure wall, stretching for over 70 meters. Near this wall, they found the remains of a fallen pillar and several smaller, rectangular blocks scattered like a child's discarded toys. Every discovery added a new word to a sentence we are still trying to read. The sonar showed that the ruins were not just isolated piles of rock, but part of a continuous, submerged landscape that extended at least 500 meters from the current shoreline. At depths of 5 to 7 meters, the man-made nature of the site became undeniable. Nature does not build right angles. It does not carve symmetrical steps into the bedrock of the ocean floor. As the mapping continued, the researchers began to notice a pattern in the orientation of the structures. They seemed to align with the surviving shore temple, suggesting that the city was once a unified whole, a sprawling coastal metropolis where the line between the land and the sea was much further out than it is today. They found evidence of what might have been a harbour, a place where ships from across the Indian Ocean once docked, bringing silk, spices and stories from distant lands. Now the only visitors are the schools of silver fish that dart between the cracks in the masonry and the occasional diver whose bubbles rise like silver prayers toward the surface. There is a profound stillness in these underwater surveys, a sense that time has not passed here so much as it has been suspended in amber. The sonar maps show us the skeletal remains of a culture, but they cannot tell us the names of the people who lived there or the songs they sang as they watched the horizon. We are left with the physical weight of the evidence, the heavy granite, the eroded carvings, the unmistakable touch of human hands on a world that has been reclaimed by the tides. The expeditions led by the National Institute of Oceanography have provided the first scientific anchor for the legends. For centuries, the Seven Pagodas were dismissed by many as a seafaring myth, a tall tale told by European travellers like Robert Southey or Marco Polo. But the sonar does not lie. The steps are there, the walls are there, the city is there, resting in the silt, waiting for the next tide or the next generation of explorers to reveal a few more inches of its long hidden face. As the research vessels eventually turned back toward the harbour, leaving the submerged city to its dark slumber, the maps they carried were more than just data. They were a testament to the fact that our maps of the world are never truly finished, and that the most enduring parts of our history may be the ones we can no longer see. The ocean is a vast library with no index, its shelves hidden in trenches and buried under centuries of sediment. Every stone found at Mahabalipuram is a book we are only just beginning to open. We look at the sonar images and see the shapes of buildings, but in the silence of the deep, one can almost hear the echoes of the bustling streets they once were. It is a reminder of the fragility of our own coastal cathedrals, and the certainty that, in the fullness of deep time, the sea always returns for what it once gave. The sound of a hammer striking a chisel is a sharp, percussive note that has echoed across the Coromandel coast for more than 1,300 years. It is a sound that bridges the gap between the living world and the silent, salt-crusted ruins that now rest beneath the surf. When the divers descend into the murky green waters off the coast of Mahabalipuram, they carry with them the memory of the shore temple, that solitary sentinel that still stands upon the dunes, braving the spray of the Bay of Bengal. As they brush away the silt from the submerged masonry, a startling realization begins to take shape in the dim light of the deep. The blocks of granite found resting on the seabed are not merely random debris or natural formations. They are the mirror images of the stones that form the base of the standing temple. The same precision in the joining, the same massive scale of the foundation blocks, and the same distinct style of the Pallava Dynasty's stonemasons are all there, preserved in the cold embrace of the ocean. It is as if the sea has kept a secret copy of the land, a blueprint of a city that was never meant to be forgotten. The architectural DNA of these ruins suggests a profound continuity between what we can see and what we can only imagine. In the standing shore temple, we see the culmination of a style, the transition from rock-cut caves to freestanding structures of stone. but the underwater ruins suggest that this was not an isolated project. The masonry found in the trenches beneath the waves reveals walls that stretch for hundreds of feet, far larger than anything currently visible on the shore. Archaeologists note that the blocks are fitted together using the same dry stone technique, relying on the sheer weight of the granite and the perfection of the cut rather than mortar. This shared language of stone tells us that the Seven Pagodas were not a myth, but a singular, cohesive vision. They were a family of monuments, born from the same royal ambition and carved by the same hands. When we compare the two, the standing temple feels less like a complete work of art and more like the final, surviving chapter of a much longer and more complex story. As we look at the layout of these structures, a grand design begins to emerge from the chaos of the seafloor. Historians and researchers have long debated the original arrangement of the seven temples. Some suggest they were lined up in a neat row along the ancient coastline, a series of beacons for sailors navigating the treacherous waters. Others believe they were arranged in a more complex, celestial pattern, perhaps mimicking a constellation or following the natural curve of the bay. The sonar data reveals a series of rectangular foundations and long straight walls that run parallel to the current shoreline, suggesting that the city was once a sprawling complex of courtyards, shrines, and perhaps even residential quarters for the priests and artisans. The sheer scale of the ruins points to a layout that integrated the natural rock outcrops of the coast into a man-made landscape. It was a city that did not merely sit upon the land, but was carved out of it, a seamless blend of nature and artifice that extended deep into what is now the sea. The spiritual heart of this layout was almost certainly governed by the movement of the heavens. In the ancient world, the orientation of a temple was never an accident. It was a calculated act of alignment with the cosmos. The shore temple, and presumably its lost companions, was designed to face the east toward the rising sun. Every morning, as the first rays of light broke over the horizon of the Bay of Bengal, they would have struck the golden kalasam atop the temples, setting the entire coastline ablaze with light. This was more than just a beautiful sight. It was a daily ritual of renewal. The sun, emerging from the dark waters, represented the triumph of order over chaos, of light over the void. For the people of Mahabalipuram, the temples were the meeting point of the three worlds, the earth beneath their feet, the vast ocean before them, and the infinite sky above. By aligning their stones with the dawn, they were anchoring their civilization to the eternal rhythms of the universe. Imagine standing on the shore 1,200 years ago, before the sea began its slow, relentless encroachment. Behind you, the sounds of the city are beginning to stir, the smell of wood smoke, the lowing of cattle, and the rhythmic clinking of the masons at work. Before you, the seven temples stand in a majestic line, their granite surfaces polished until they shine like mirrors. As the sun rises, the shadows of the temples stretch long across the sand, reaching toward the bustling harbour, where ships from across the Indian Ocean are coming to rest. The alignment with the sun created a sacred corridor of light, a path that connected the divine realms with the mundane world of trade and politics. It was a statement of power and piety, written in the heaviest material the earth could provide, intended to last for all of eternity. And yet, the very ocean that the sun rose out of every morning was the force that would eventually claim these monuments for its own. There is a certain irony in the fact that the rising sun, which once illuminated the glory of the Seven Pagodas, now shines down on a surface of water that hides them from view. The spiritual significance of the alignment remains, even if the structures themselves have shifted. To the modern observer, the mystery of the layout is a puzzle of deep time. We look at the gaps in the sonar maps and wonder about the spaces in between. Was there a central plaza where the people gathered? were there gardens and pools that are now filled with sand and coral. The evidence suggests a level of urban planning that was centuries ahead of its time, a sophisticated understanding of how to manage the interface between a growing city and a volatile coast. The builders of Mahabalipuram knew the sea. They lived by its bounty, and they understood its moods. Perhaps they even knew that their work was temporary, a fleeting gesture of beauty in a world defined by change. The connection between the land and the sea at Mahabalipuram is not just a matter of geography, it is a matter of memory. The masonry we find underwater is a physical link to a past that was nearly erased by time and tide. Each block of granite is a witness to the transition from the solid world of the shore to the fluid world of the deep. As we map the foundations and trace the lines of the walls, we are reconstructing a lost landscape, piece by piece. We are learning that the 7 pagodas were not just 7 buildings, but a single unified expression of human spirit and engineering. They were a bridge between the known and the unknown, a way for a civilization to plant its feet on the ground while reaching for the stars. The ocean may have taken the temples, but it could not wash away the intent of the people who built them. Their vision remains, etched into the very floor of the sea, waiting for the light of discovery to find it once again. As the tide pulls back and the waves crash against the solitary shore temple, we are reminded of the fragility of our own creations. The granite is hard, but the water is patient. The alignment with the sun continues, day after day, century after century, regardless of whether there is a temple there to catch the light. In the silence of the underwater ruins, there is a profound sense of peace, the peace of a place that has finished its work and returned to the elements. We are the ones who feel the loss, who seek to categorize and understand, while the stones themselves simply exist in the deep. They are part of the ocean now, as much a part of the seabed as the reefs and the sand, and yet they still speak to us of a time when the world was larger, when the gods walked the shore, and when 7 golden towers greeted the morning sun. The story of Mahabalipuram is a story of what happens when the land and the sea decide to swap places, and the enduring beauty that remains in the wake of that change. The salt air carries a specific weight here, a heavy, humid presence that seems to press against the skin with the wisdom of 1,000 years. It is a silent, invisible force, constantly at work, slowly smoothing the sharp corners of the granite carvings until the faces of gods and celestial dancers begin to blur, returning to the raw, unshaped stone from which they were born. In this quiet erosion, we find the central paradox of Mahabalipuram. We have spent centuries searching for what was lost to the waves, yet we are still struggling to understand why the living city, the one that remained on the shore, was ever left behind to begin with. History tells us of a flourishing port, a jewel of the Pallava Dynasty, where the air was thick with the scent of spices and the sounds of a dozen foreign tongues, and then the records grow thin. The bustling docks fell silent. The stone carvers laid down their chisels. We are left to wonder if it was a slow retreat, a gradual fading of economic power as the Silk Roads shifted, or if the sea, having already claimed 6 of the 7 pagodas, simply became too menacing a neighbor to live beside any longer. There is no single layer of sediment, no sudden ashfall like that of Pompeii, to give us a definitive answer. Instead, the archaeology speaks of a slow transition. When researchers examine the stratigraphy, that is, the study of the layers of earth and debris that build up over time like the pages of a book, they see a story of waning influence. They look for markers of abandonment, perhaps a change in the types of pottery found in the upper levels, or a lack of new construction. But the stones themselves offer little comfort to those seeking a tidy conclusion. They stand in a state of perpetual waiting, caught between the glory of their creation and the inevitable reclamation by the elements. The salt is the true enemy now. It crystallizes within the pores of the rock, expanding with a quiet, microscopic violence that flakes away the surface of history, millimeter by millimeter. It is a reminder that even the most enduring monuments are, in the eyes of deep time, merely temporary guests on the landscape. As we walk among these weathered giants, we feel the immense pressure of the centuries. The mystery of the depths has become a part of the modern Indian identity, a tether to a past that is both tangible and ethereal. For the people of Tamil Nadu, and indeed for the entire nation, the Seven Pagodas are no longer just a sailor's myth or a maritime legend. They are a symbol of resilience. When the Great Tsunami of 2004 receded, it did more than just reveal old stones. It validated a cultural memory that had been passed down through generations of fishing families who had always insisted that something magnificent lay beneath the surf. It proved that the stories told by grandmothers in the firelight were not mere fantasies, but echoes of a submerged reality. This realization has sparked a renewed sense of pride, a feeling that the land beneath one's feet holds secrets far older and more profound than any written record could ever encompass. The ongoing battle to preserve what remains is a delicate dance with nature. Conservationists work tirelessly to coat the stones in protective resins, trying to shield the delicate relief carvings from the corrosive breath of the Bay of Bengal. They are fighting against the very environment that makes the site so hauntingly beautiful. There is a melancholy in this effort, a recognition that we are trying to pause a process of decay that has been in motion for over a millennium. We use modern chemistry to fight ancient winds, hoping to buy a few more decades, perhaps a few more centuries, for a masterpiece that was intended to last forever. Meanwhile, the divers continue their work in the murky green silence offshore. Every expedition brings back a few more fragments of the puzzle, a carved block here, a section of a wall there, but the grand design remains elusive. The ocean is a jealous guardian of its treasures. It covers the ruins in thick carpets of kelp and shells, blurring the lines between man-made structures and natural rock formations. To explore these depths is to confront the limits of human knowledge. We possess satellites that can map the surface of distant planets, yet we cannot fully map the city that lies just a few hundred meters from our own shores. We are reminded of the concept of deep time, the vast, unfathomable stretches of history that make a human life seem like a single heartbeat. In the grand timeline of the earth, the rise and fall of the Pallava kings is a brief flicker, a momentary ripple on the surface of a vast and ancient sea. The myth of the Seven Pagodas has transitioned from a maritime ghost story into a living testament of endurance. It challenges our understanding of how civilizations end and how they are remembered. Was the city abandoned because the sea became a predator, or did the people simply lose their connection to the water that had once brought them wealth? Perhaps the answer lies in the very silence of the ruins. They do not demand to be understood, they only ask to be seen. As the sun dips lower, casting long, bruised shadows across the sand, the monuments seem to settle deeper into the earth. The shore temple, with its twin towers reaching for the darkening sky, stands as a lonely sentinel, the last of its kind, watching over its sunken siblings. There is a peace in this uncertainty, a comfort in knowing that not everything has been catalogued, measured, and explained. In a world that often feels too small, too mapped and explored, Mahabalipuram offers a sanctuary for the imagination. It is a place where the boundary between the seen and the unseen is as thin as the foam on the crest of a wave. The stones will continue to weather, the sea will continue to pulse against the shore, and the mystery will remain, held safely in the cold, dark embrace of the deep. It is a story without an end, a narrative that continues to be written by the tides and the wind, whispered in the salt spray to anyone patient enough to listen. The sound of a single hammer striking stone echoes across the centuries, a rhythmic ghost that still seems to vibrate within the granite walls of the shore temple. Standing here, where the salt-crusted earth meets the relentless pull of the Bay of Bengal, one feels the heavy, cooling presence of the last sentinel, the final pagoda that refused to be swallowed by the hungry horizon. It is a structure that does not merely sit upon the land, but rather seems to emerge from it, a defiant crystallization of human will carved from the very bones of the earth. We find ourselves at the edge of the world, where the air smells of brine and ancient minerals, looking upon a monument that has watched the rise and fall of empires with the same unblinking, stony gaze. There is a profound stillness in the way the shore temple occupies its space, a silence that seems to deepen as the tide creeps closer to its foundations. For over 1,200 years, this structure has endured the abrasive kiss of the wind and the corrosive touch of the spree, yet it remains a solitary survivor of a vanished brotherhood. As we walk the perimeter of its weathered base, the mind naturally wanders to the 6 companions it supposedly lost to the depths. We consider the cyclical nature of all things, the way the sea gives and the way the sea takes away, governed by rhythms that dwarf the brief flicker of a human lifespan. The stone under our fingertips feels cold and damp, a physical bridge to the 8th century, reminding us that while our flesh is fleeting, our aspirations can be etched into the eternal. The shore temple was not built for comfort, nor was it built for the convenience of those who dwell in the present. It was an offering to the divine and a challenge to the elements, a masterpiece of Pallava architecture that sought to harmonize the celestial with the terrestrial. As the water pulses against the nearby rocks, we are reminded of the stratigraphy of memory, those layers of history that become compressed and distorted by the weight of time. In archaeology, stratigraphy is the study of these layers, a way of reading the earth like a book where the deepest pages are the oldest. But here, the sea has rewritten the text, scrambling the chapters and leaving us with fragments of a story that may never be fully reconstructed. We must contemplate the resilience of this granite, a rock born from the cooling of molten hearts deep within the planet, brought to the surface only to be shaped by the hands of poets and masons. It is a material that understands deep time, those vast, unfathomable stretches of geological history that make the reign of a king seem like the blinking of an eye. When the tsunami of 2004 receded, it did more than just reveal sand-swept ruins. It pulled back the veil on our own understanding of permanence. It showed us that the earth remembers what we have forgotten, and that the legends we dismiss as mere folklore are often the echoes of a truth that has been submerged but never extinguished. The shore temple stands as a meditation on the limits of our vision. We look out at the grey-blue expanse of the water and see only a flat horizon. Yet we now know that beneath that surface lies a landscape of drowned walls and silent courtyards. It is a reminder that the world is far deeper than it appears, and that our knowledge is often restricted to the thin sliver of reality that remains above the waterline. The temple is a threshold, a place where the known ends and the vast, watery unknown begins. It invites us to sit in the shadow of its vimana, its towering spire, and consider the many things that have been lost to the tides of history, not just buildings and statues, but languages, songs, and the specific dreams of the people who once walked these shores. As the years continue to pass, the temple will continue its slow, graceful transformation. The sharp edges of the carvings will soften further. The features of the stone deities will blur until they are indistinguishable from the natural contours of the rock, and eventually the temple may return to the state from which it was fashioned. This is not a tragedy, but rather a completion of a circle. There is a strange comfort in the endurance of memory, the way the story of the Seven Pagodas survived in the mouths of fishermen and the journals of travelers long after the physical evidence had been hidden from view. It suggests that as long as there is someone to tell the tale, the city is never truly lost. The tides will come and go, governed by the distant, silent pull of the moon, and the shore temple will remain at its post, a silent witness to the passage of an era we can barely comprehend. It is a place to let go of the anxieties of the modern world and sink into the slow, rhythmic heartbeat of the coast. Here, the boundary between the past and the present dissolves, leaving only the salt, the stone, and the sound of the waves. We are left with the image of the temple as a lighthouse of history, casting its light not across the water to guide ships, but across the centuries to guide our imagination. In the quiet of the evening, when the wind dies down and the ocean becomes a mirror for the darkening sky, the shore temple seems to breathe. It is the breath of the earth itself, a slow and steady exhalation that has continued since the first stone was laid. We realize that we are not just observers of this place, but participants in its ongoing narrative. Every footfall on the sand, every hand placed against the granite, becomes a part of the temple's long history. The mystery of the Seven Pagodas does not need to be solved to be felt. Its power lies in the very fact that it remains partially hidden, a secret shared between the land and the deep. And so, we leave the temple to its silent vigil, standing at the edge of the world where the water meets the stone. We carry with us the weight of forgotten ages and the lightness of a story rediscovered. The stones will weather, the tides will pulse, and the deep will hold its secrets for as long as it chooses. But for now, the shore temple remains, a solitary, beautiful reminder of what it means to build something that lasts, to dream something that survives the storm, and to wait patiently for the sea to reveal what has been hidden in its cold, dark embrace. The mystery remains, whispered in the salt spray, a narrative without an end, written by the wind and the waves through the long, slow march of time.